Greetings, my wonderful students. Today we discuss the Atlantic slave trade, part of the Age of Exploration when it began. First, it starts with mercantilism. Now, mercantilism was an economic theory at the time. Europeans believed that for a nation to be economically healthy, it needed to have large supplies of gold and silver. So the goal was to collect as much gold and silver as possible. To gain this, a nation needed to have a favorable balance of trade, to sell more than it bought. To gain a favorable balance of trade, a nation would tax imports, goods that were coming in from other countries, and provide subsidies or money to help their own businesses stay in business. So here we have a graphic which shows you the colony, because this is an age of colonization. The colony was meant to provide raw materials to the mother country or colonizing country, and that mother country or colonial power would provide manufactured goods to the colony. In this way, they would have a favorable balance of trade because instead of trading with a foreign country, they would be trading with their own colony. So colonies were valuable for resources, so you did not have to buy those resources from other countries. It also gave the mother country a place to sell their finished goods, so they didn't have to rely on a foreign country to buy their goods. The purpose of the colony was to benefit the mother country. And it's very important to remember that because the colonists themselves, whether they included people from the mother country or native peoples to the region or people, enslaved people such as Africans who were forced to migrate there, none of those people who lived in the colony were the primary concern of the mother country. It was always the mother country was looking out for itself. The encomienda system. In the encomienda system, Native Americans were forced to work for the Spanish and to pay tribute, taxes, to them. The Spanish used Native Americans to work on plantations and in mines in their colonies. The plantations grew cash crops, valuable crops to be sold for money. The Middle Passage. Because so many Native Americans died from smallpox, the Europeans began to import large numbers of African slaves to work on the plantations. So as a direct result of smallpox killing large amounts of Native Americans, it caused the Atlantic slave trade to start. Now, the transatlantic slave trade brought an estimated 11 million to 14 million slaves to the Americas. It is the largest forced migration in human history, and many were chained below decks in horrible conditions. In some cases, many of them actually dying of disease before they even made it to the New World. Now, the triangular trade. Merchants would ship cotton goods, weapons, and liquor to Africa. They would start in Europe, ship those to Africa, then they would take slaves from Africa to the Americas, and then they would bring raw materials and cash crops from the Americas back to Europe. Slaves shipped from Africa to the Americas, merchants' raw materials back to be made into finished products. Sources of enslaved Africans. Now, slavery had existed in Africa and other parts of the world for centuries. This was not a new invention. The Greeks had slaves, the Romans had slaves, the Chinese had slaves. This was a normal part of many cultures. Most slaves were prisoners of war. This was not based on race at this time. It was based on who was captured in a war would then be made slaves in the country that captured them. So this was a normal practice in human history at this time. Now, the discovery of the Americas greatly increased the demand for slaves to work on the plantations. So what was happening was Europeans needed slaves, and because African nations went to war with each other, they ended up capturing people as slaves, and then when the Europeans showed up, they said, hey, they wanted to buy some slaves, and the African leaders would then sell the slaves they had captured from other African kingdoms to the Europeans. Now, because the African kingdoms gained slaves by going to war, the increase in demand for slaves caused more wars to occur in Africa between African kings. King Afonso of the Congo protested to the Portuguese that his country was being depopulated by the slave trade. The population was actually going down. And the kingdom of Benin was completely destroyed by the slave trade. So all of these are effects of the Age of Exploration on this time period. And that's this lesson.